The morning fog clung to the Belgian countryside like a burial shroud, thick and gray and suffocating. Sergeant Wilhelm Hartmann pressed his eye against the commander's periscope of his tiger eye, scanning the hedgerows that bordered the muddy road leading into the village of Hollebeek. The metal was cold against his skin, and his breath came out in visible clouds inside the cramped fighting compartment. It was November 1944, and the war was losing its thunder, replaced by something quieter and more desperate. A slow bleeding that no amount of propaganda could stanch. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Movement at 2 o'clock, said Corporal Ernst Becker from the gunner's position, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fear that came from seeing too many friends burn alive in their machines. Ernst was 23 but looked 40, his face carved with worry lines that deepened every time they rolled into combat. He had joined the Panzerwaffe believing in invincibility, in the technological superiority that their training officers had drilled into them like gospel. The Tiger was supposed to be unstoppable, 88mm of divine retribution wrapped in 50 tons of Krupp steel. Wilhelm adjusted his position, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back from too many hours compressed into this iron coffin. "I don't see anything. Are you certain?" "I saw a flash. Sunlight on glass, maybe. Or a scope." The loader, Hans Vogel, a farm boy from Bavaria with hands like shovels and a perpetual expression of bewildered innocence, shifted nervously. "Should we inform Lieutenant Steiner?" Wilhelm considered this. Lieutenant Maximilian Steiner commanded their platoon of 4 Tigers from the lead tank, 50 meters ahead. He was a by-the-book officer, a man who still believed that discipline and tactical doctrine could overcome the reality that they were now fighting a war of attrition against enemies who had more of everything. More tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, more men, more hope. "Not yet," Wilhelm said. "Could be nothing. Could be a farmer checking his ruined fields." But it wasn't nothing. Wilhelm had been fighting since Poland, had survived the exhilaration of France, the frozen hell of Russia, and now this slow collapse back toward the fatherland. He had developed an instinct for danger, a sixth sense that hummed along his nerves like electricity. Something was wrong with this morning, wrong with the way the mist moved, wrong with the silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. Their Tiger, bearing the number 331 painted in white on its turret, was part of Schwer Panzerabteilung 501, one of the heavy tank battalions that had been pulled from the Eastern Front and rushed west to stem the Allied advance after the Normandy breakout. They had been in Belgium for 3 weeks, fighting delaying actions, losing ground meter by meter, watching their numbers dwindle not just from combat but from mechanical failures and lack of spare parts. Wilhelm's crew had started the month with 8 Tigers in their company. Now they had 4. "Driver, halt!" Wilhelm commanded into his throat microphone. Friedrich Meyer, wedged into the driver's compartment at the front of the tank, brought the 56-ton beast to a grinding stop. Friedrich was the oldest member of the crew at 31, a veteran of the Afrika Korps who rarely spoke but whose steady hands on the controls had saved them more times than Wilhelm could count. He had a wife and 2 daughters back in Hamburg, and he carried a photograph of them tucked into his breast pocket, protected by a piece of oilcloth that he checked obsessively before every engagement. The Tiger's Maybach engine idled with a deep, throaty rumble that Wilhelm felt in his bones. Around them, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing a landscape of devastation. Burned-out farmhouses, shattered trees, fields cratered by artillery. The war had chewed through this place and spat it out, leaving nothing but ghosts and mud. "All stations, this is Tiger Lead." Lieutenant Steiner's voice crackled over the radio. "Hold position. I'm getting reports of enemy armor in the village. Shermans, probably. We'll advance on my command and engage at maximum range. Remember your training. They have numbers, but we have the gun. 1 Tiger is worth 10 of their tin cans." Wilhelm had heard variations of this speech 100 times. It had been true once, back when they were fighting in open terrain where the Tiger's superior optics and powerful 88mm gun could kill enemy tanks from distances they couldn't even dream of returning fire. But this wasn't the steppes of Russia or the deserts of North Africa. This was close country, all hedgerows and buildings and concealment, where the Sherman's mobility and numbers could overwhelm them if they weren't careful. "Ernst, load armor-piercing," Wilhelm ordered. The clang of the breech opening, the smooth slide of the heavy shell, the solid thunk of it seating properly. These were the sounds of their profession, the liturgy of armored combat. Wilhelm watched through his periscope as the fog continued to thin, revealing more of the village ahead. Hollebeek had been home to maybe 300 people before the war. Now it was a strategic position, nothing more. A collection of stone buildings and a crossroads that some staff officer had marked on a map as necessary to hold. "AP loaded," Ernst confirmed. "Good. Traverse left, 10 degrees. Range, approximately 1,000 meters." The turret whined as Ernst worked the controls, bringing the long 88mm gun to bear on the village. Wilhelm could hear Friedrich breathing heavily through the intercom, could sense Hans's tension as the loader prepared to feed the gun again as soon as they fired. They had been a crew for 18 months, and they moved together now with the unconscious coordination of long practice. "Tiger lead, this is Tiger 3, Wilhelm said into his radio. "I have a bad feeling about this approach. The visibility is improving, but there are too many blind spots. Request permission to advance by bounds, using mutual support." There was a pause. Then Steiner's irritated voice. "Negative Tiger 3. We advance together online. The enemy doesn't have anything that can hurt us beyond 800 meters. We'll destroy them before they know we're there." Wilhelm's jaw tightened. This was the arrogance that had been getting them killed, the refusal to adapt to changing circumstances. But he was a sergeant, not an officer, and in the German army you followed orders even when you knew they were wrong. "Understood. Tiger lead. Tiger 3 ready to advance. All Tigers forward. Combat speed. Gunners, you are free to engage targets of opportunity." Friedrich engaged the gears, and the Tiger lurched forward, its tracks clanking against the road surface. The other 3 tanks of their platoon spread out into a ragged line, maintaining rough intervals of 50 meters between vehicles. They were moving at perhaps 15 kilometers per hour, fast enough to get into position but slow enough to keep their guns stable for shooting. Wilhelm scanned constantly, his eyes aching from the strain. The village was taking shape through the dissipating fog. Stone houses with collapsed roofs, a church with its steeple shot away, rubble-choked streets. He saw no movement, no sign of the enemy that intelligence claimed was there. But his instinct was screaming now, that animal part of his brain that evolution had designed to detect predators. "Range to village 800 meters, Ernst said, his voice steady despite the tension Wilhelm could hear underneath. "I have multiple positions that could conceal enemy armor. Should I prioritize the church or the world exploded. The impact came from their right flank, from a direction Wilhelm wasn't even watching. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard before. Not the familiar crack of a Sherman's 75mm, but something sharper, angrier, more violent. The shell struck Tiger 332, Lieutenant Steiner's tank, at the junction between the turret and hull. Wilhelm watched in horror as the armor-piercing round punched through the supposedly impenetrable Tiger armor as if it were paper. Steiner's tank lurched to a halt. For a moment nothing happened. Then the hatches blew open, and black smoke began pouring out. 2 figures emerged from the turret, wreathed in flames, and fell to the ground, rolling desperately in the mud. The Tiger began to burn in earnest, bright orange flames licking up from every opening. And Wilhelm knew with sick certainty that the other 3 crew members weren't coming out. "Contact right," Wilhelm screamed. "Traverse right. Friedrich, turn us." But even as he shouted the commands, another shot rang out. This one struck Tiger 334, the tank commanded by Sergeant Klaus Hoffmann, who had 3 children and a small grocery store waiting for him in Leipzig. The round hit the lower glassy plate, supposedly the strongest armor on the tank, and penetrated. The Tiger shuddered, lurched forward as its driver spasmed on the controls, and then stopped. No hatches opened. No survivors emerged. "Where is it?" Ernst was shouting, his voice cracking. "I can't see it. Wilhelm, I can't see it." Wilhelm's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. They were being engaged at a range where the enemy shouldn't even be able to hit them, let alone penetrate their armor. The Tigers were supposed to be able to see and kill first. That was the entire doctrine. But someone was shooting at them from beyond visual range, and whatever they were shooting with had the power to kill Tigers. The third shot. This one missed Tiger 335, the tank commanded by Corporal Dietermann, but it passed so close that Wilhelm saw the tracer in his periscope, a streak of light moving at impossible speed. Dieter's tank immediately reversed, its driver panicking, and began backing away from the killing ground. All tanks retreat, Wilhelm ordered, knowing he was overstepping his authority but no longer caring. Friedrich, get us out of here. Reverse, full speed. The Tiger lurched backward, its transmission screaming in protest. Wilhelm kept his eyes locked on the direction the shots had come from, desperately searching for the enemy that was killing them. And then he saw it, just for a moment, a muzzle flash from a hedgerow 1,700 meters away, far beyond the range where they'd been told Shermans could effectively engage. But as the fog cleared completely, he caught a glimpse of the silhouette. It was a Sherman chassis, yes, but something was wrong with the turret. The gun was longer, much longer than the stubby 75mm that Shermans normally carried. And the muzzle brake at the end was distinctive, nothing like American design. A fourth shot cracked out. This one caught Tiger 335 as it reversed, striking the thinner rear armor. The tank exploded spectacularly, ammunition cooking off in a series of violent detonations that threw pieces of the turret 20 meters into the air. Wilhelm felt the blast wave even from 200 meters away, felt the heat of the flames on his face. In less than 90 seconds, they had gone from 4 Tigers to 1. 12 men dead, 8 wounded, 3 tanks burning, and 1 reduced to scattered metal. And Wilhelm still hadn't gotten off a single shot because he couldn't even see the enemy clearly enough to engage. Friedrich, behind that farmhouse. Wilhelm pointed at a ruined building that offered some concealment. Get us into cover now. The Tiger crashed through a wooden fence and positioned itself behind the shattered stone walls, only its gun barrel protruding. Wilhelm's hands were shaking as he tried to key the radio, tried to call for support, tried to make sense of what had just happened. Tiger 3 to battalion, he gasped into the microphone. We've been engaged by unknown enemy tanks with extremely long-range capability. We've lost 3 vehicles. I repeat, 3 Tigers destroyed by a single enemy tank from outside our effective range. Whatever they're using, it's not a standard Sherman. Request orders. The radio crackled with static, then confusion, then disbelief. Because what Wilhelm was reporting was impossible. Everyone knew the Tiger was superior. Everyone knew the 88mm could outrange anything the Allies had. Everyone knew the armor was impenetrable to enemy fire at long range. But Wilhelm had just watched 3 Tigers burn, killed by an enemy they couldn't even effectively fight back against. And as he sat in the commander's position of the last surviving tank, watching black smoke rise from the pyres of his comrades, he realized something that chilled him more than the November cold ever could. They had been fighting this war believing in their own invincibility, trusting in the technical specifications and the training manuals and the assurances of their superiors. But somewhere, somehow, the enemy had found a way to beat them at their own game. And Wilhelm and his crew were now alone, outgunned, and facing an opponent they didn't understand. Hans was praying softly in the loader's position, his hands still clutching an armor-piercing shell. Ernst had gone completely silent, staring at his gun sight as if it had betrayed him. Friedrich was breathing in ragged gasps, probably thinking about his wife and daughters, wondering if he'd ever see them again. And Wilhelm, 26 years old and suddenly the senior surviving tank commander of what had been a platoon, had to figure out how to keep them alive against an enemy that could kill Tigers at 1,700 meters. The fog was completely gone now, and the morning sun was bright and cold. Wilhelm could see the 3 burning Tigers clearly, could see bodies lying in the mud, could see the Sherman, or whatever it was, still positioned in that distant hedgerow, waiting like a patient predator for its next victim to appear. He thought of his mother in Stuttgart, who wrote him letters every week filled with news about the neighbors and the garden and the increasingly heavy bombing raids. He thought of his younger sister, who was 16 and working in a munitions factory, doing her part for the war effort. He thought of the girl he'd been in love with before the war, who had married someone else after Wilhelm had been gone for 2 years, and he couldn't even blame her for not waiting. And he thought about the question that had been growing in his mind for months now, the treasonous question that he'd never dared speak aloud. What if everything they'd been told was a lie? What if they weren't the invincible armored fist of the Wehrmacht? What if they were just men in machines, and the machines weren't as good as they'd been promised? Wilhelm, Ernst said quietly, what do we do? It was a simple question with no good answer. They could run, abandoning the position and their dead comrades. They could stay and fight, trying to avenge their losses against an enemy that had already proven it could kill them with impunity. Or they could sit here behind this ruined farmhouse, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, until orders came from someone who wasn't here and didn't understand what they were facing. Wilhelm made his decision. We pull back to the secondary position, 2 kilometers west. We inform battalion about what we saw, that long-barreled gun, the extended range, and we stay alive long enough to figure out what we're up against. That's retreating, Hans said, his voice small and frightened. They'll say we're cowards. They can say whatever they want, Wilhelm replied, surprised by the bitterness in his own voice. I'd rather be a living coward than a dead hero. And I'd rather warn the other crews about this new threat than die, maintaining a defensive position that's already been turned into a killing ground. He keyed the radio again. Tiger 3 to battalion. We are withdrawing to position Gamma. The enemy has a new weapon system, longer ranged than anything in our intelligence reports. Recommend all Tiger units exercise extreme caution and engage at maximum range. Tiger 3 out. As Friedrich carefully backed the Tiger away from the farmhouse and began the journey west, Wilhelm took one last look at the burning wrecks of his platoon. Lieutenant Steiner had been wrong about the Tiger's invincibility, and that mistake had killed him and 10 other men. But Wilhelm was damned if he was going to let the same ignorance kill him and his crew. Somewhere out there, the British or Americans had deployed a new tank destroyer, something that could match or exceed the Tiger's capabilities. And until Wilhelm understood what it was and how to fight it, every engagement was Russian roulette with armor-piercing shells. The thought terrified him. But more terrifying still was the realization that if the enemy could do this to Tigers, the most feared tanks on any battlefield, then what did that say about Germany's chances of winning this war? Wilhelm didn't have an answer. He only had questions, fear, and the desperate hope that he could keep his crew alive long enough to find some meaning in this nightmare. The secondary position turned out to be a shallow depression behind a tree line, offering minimal cover and even less comfort. Wilhelm brought Tiger 331 to a halt in the shadow of a cluster of skeletal oaks, their branches stripped bare by shellfire. Friedrich killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, Wilhelm could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could hear Hans quietly weeping in the loader's position, could hear Ernst's labored breathing through the intercom. Everybody out, Wilhelm said, his voice hoarse. We need to inspect for damage and refuel. 10-minute break. They climbed out of the tank like old men, joints stiff from tension and cold. The November air bit at Wilhelm's face, but he welcomed it after the close, oil and sweat smell of the fighting compartment. He jumped down from the turret, his boots squelching in the mud, and immediately lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The tobacco was low quality, harsh enough to make him cough, but it gave him something to focus on besides the image of Lieutenant Steiner burning alive. Hans sat on the rear deck of the tank, his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. Ernst paced back and forth, muttering to himself, occasionally kicking at stones with vicious intensity. Friedrich, as always, was checking the tank methodically, examining track links, testing bogey wheels, running his hand along the armor as if searching for wounds. We should go back, Hans said suddenly, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. There might be survivors. Klaus had a family. His wife is pregnant. We should. There are no survivors. Wilhelm cut him off, more harshly than he intended. You saw what happened to those tanks. The ammunition cooked off. Nobody could survive that. But we don't know for sure. We just ran. We left them there. Wilhelm grabbed Hans by the shoulders, forcing the younger man to meet his eyes. Listen to me. If we had gone back, we'd be dead too. That enemy tank was still there, still watching. It would have killed us the same way it killed the others. You understand? We did the only thing we could do. We survived. Hans pulled away, wrapping his arms around himself. My brother died at Kursk, he said quietly. In a Panzer IV. They told my mother he died a hero fighting for the fatherland. But I always wondered if he was scared at the end. If he knew he was going to die. If he thought about home. Wilhelm didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been good with words, with comfort. He was good at giving orders, at reading terrain, at keeping his crew alive. But this kind of pain was beyond his ability to fix. Ernst stopped pacing and came over, his angular face tight with controlled anger. That wasn't a normal Sherman, he said. I got a good look at it through the scope before everything went to hell. The gun was different, longer, and I think I saw a muzzle brake which Shermans don't have. What the hell are we facing? Wilhelm exhaled smoke, watching it dissipate in the cold air. I don't know. British modification, maybe? They've been doing strange things with their tanks. Remember those flail tanks we saw at Ken, the ones that cleared mines? Maybe this is something similar. An improvement. An improvement, Ernst repeated bitterly. They've turned their garbage tank into something that can kill tigers from outside our own engagement range. Do you know what that means? It means everything we've been taught is obsolete. It means we don't have the advantage anymore. Friedrich came around from his inspection, wiping his hands on a rag. Track tension is good. No visible damage. We have maybe 200 kilometers of fuel left, enough for 3 or 4 more engagements if we're careful. Ammunition status? 61 rounds remaining, Ernst said automatically. 40 armor-piercing, 15 high-explosive, 6 tungsten core. Full load. Good. Wilhelm flicked his cigarette away and pulled out his map case, spreading the tactical map across the Tiger's engine deck. Battalion headquarters is here, about 8 kilometers northwest. We need to report in person, show them what we saw. Maybe intelligence has information about this new weapon. Maybe other units have encountered it. And if they order us back into combat before we understand what we're facing? Ernst asked. Wilhelm folded the map carefully. Then we follow orders. We're soldiers. That's what we do. Soldiers who are being fed into a meat grinder, Ernst muttered. But he didn't argue further. They spent the next 30 minutes performing maintenance, the familiar routine offering a kind of meditation. Wilhelm checked the radio equipment, ensuring they could still communicate with battalion. Hans cleaned the interior of the fighting compartment, wiping down surfaces with the obsessive care of someone trying not to think. Ernst lovingly cleaned the breech of the 88mm gun, running patches through the barrel, checking the recoil mechanism. Friedrich topped off the fuel tanks from jerry cans they carried on the rear deck, the sharp smell of gasoline mixing with the perpetual odor of cordite and oil. Wilhelm found himself thinking about the weeks before this morning, the relatively quiet period they'd enjoyed after being transferred from the Eastern Front. They'd been billeted in a small Belgian town called Mons, living in the house of a middle-aged widow named Madame Devereux, who spoke neither German nor English but had somehow communicated through gestures and expressions that she was simply waiting for the war to pass over her like a storm. She had cooked for them sometimes, despite the rationing. Thin soups made from vegetables scrounged from abandoned gardens, bread baked from flour mixed with sawdust to stretch it further. Wilhelm had tried to pay her with his own rations, but she'd refused, shaking her head and saying something in rapid French that he didn't understand but that sounded like resignation. Her husband had died in the First War, she'd managed to convey through a photograph she kept on the mantel. A young man in a French uniform, frozen forever at 23. Wilhelm had looked at that photograph and thought about how his own picture might look on his mother's mantel, another young man killed in another stupid war, and the thought had made him feel hollow inside. Ernst had tried to befriend the local children, giving them chocolate from his rations and playing simple games in the street despite the regulations against fraternizing. Hans had spent hours in the town's damaged church, praying or just sitting in silence, seeking some kind of peace that Wilhelm suspected he'd never find. Friedrich had written letters to his wife every evening, filling page after page with descriptions of the countryside, the weather, anything except the war itself. And Wilhelm had walked the perimeter every night, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about Russia. The endless snow, the cold that froze your breath in your lungs, the villages they'd burned, following orders, watching families flee into the winter with whatever they could carry. The partisan attacks, brutal and indiscriminate, answered with reprisals equally brutal. The slow retreat, losing friends to cold and hunger and Soviet tanks, leaving Germany's dreams of empire frozen in the mud of the Eastern Front. He'd killed so many people. He didn't know the exact number. You didn't keep count of high-explosive shells fired into buildings that might contain enemy soldiers or might contain civilians or might contain both. You didn't keep count of machine gun bursts into retreating figures, of tanks crushed under your treads, of distant specks that you're going to reported as target destroyed. Sometimes, late at night, Wilhelm wondered if he was already damned. If there was a God, would he forgive a man who had followed orders that resulted in so much death? Or was Wilhelm already condemned, just going through the motions of existence until the inevitable bullet or shell caught up with him? Wilhelm, Friedrich's voice pulled him back to the present. You okay? You've been staring at nothing for 5 minutes. Wilhelm blinked, realizing he'd been standing completely still, lost in memory. I'm fine, just thinking. Dangerous habit. Thinking, Friedrich said with the ghost of a smile, gets you into trouble. Everything gets us into trouble these days. They mounted up again at 0930 hours, the familiar ritual of climbing into their positions made somber by the knowledge of how quickly the Tiger could become a coffin. Wilhelm settled into the commander's seat, adjusting his headset, running through his pre-combat checks with mechanical precision. Driver, start engine, he ordered. The Maybach roared to life, that powerful V12 sound that had once filled Wilhelm with confidence. Now it just seemed loud, a beacon announcing their position to anyone within a kilometer who cared to listen. Tiger 3 to battalion, we are departing position Gamma and heading to headquarters. Estimated arrival time 30 minutes. Request status update on enemy activity in our area. Over. The radio crackled. Then a young-sounding voice responded, Tiger 3, this is battalion. We've received your report about the engagement. Command wants a full debrief immediately upon arrival. Be advised, we've lost contact with Schwerpanzerabteilung 502 in your sector. Their last transmission reported engaging enemy armor with unusually effective long-range fire. Exercise extreme caution. Battalion out. Wilhelm felt his stomach drop. Another heavy tank battalion, gone silent. How many more Tigers had been killed by these mystery tanks? How many more crews had died still believing they were invincible? Friedrich, take us through the river valley route, Wilhelm said. Stay off the main roads. If these new enemy tanks have the range we saw, we need to use every bit of terrain we can for cover. Understood. It'll add 15 minutes to our travel time. I'd rather arrive 15 minutes late than not arrive at all. They rolled out, the Tiger's tracks grinding against the muddy ground, leaving deep impressions that would give away their route to any competent tracker. The Belgian countryside passed by outside Wilhelm's periscope. Destroyed farms, cratered fields, the occasional burned-out vehicle marking previous battles. The war had scoured this land clean of normalcy, leaving only desolation. Hans spoke suddenly over the intercom, his voice thick with emotion. Do you think we're the bad guys? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ernst sucked in a sharp breath. Friedrich's hands tightened on the controls. Wilhelm felt something twist inside his chest. What kind of question is that? Ernst said, but there was no heat in his voice, only exhaustion. I mean, we invaded Poland, then France, then Russia. We're not defending our homes anymore. We're just here, in Belgium, fighting people who didn't ask for this. And for what? We're following orders, Wilhelm said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. We're soldiers. We don't make the policies. We just follow orders, Hans finished bitterly. That's what the officers always say. But when do we become responsible for our own actions? When do we stop hiding behind orders? Wilhelm wanted to argue, to defend their service, to justify the years of killing and dying. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, in the part of himself he tried never to examine too closely, he'd been asking the same question for a long time. "My father fought in the last war," Friedrich said quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Verdun. He came back with one lung and nightmares that lasted until the day he died. You know what he told me before I enlisted? He said, 'War makes monsters of us all. The only question is whether we can find our way back to being human afterward.' I think about that a lot. Whether there's anything human left in me to save." They drove in silence for a long time after that, each man alone with his thoughts, trapped inside the steel coffin that was both their protection and their prison. Wilhelm watched the landscape roll by and thought about choices, about responsibility, about the difference between following orders and being complicit. He thought about the Russian villages, about the columns of prisoners marching east, their faces hollow with hunger and despair, about the summary executions he'd witnessed, the collective punishments, the calculated cruelty that had been dressed up as necessary military action. He'd never pulled the trigger on an unarmed person. That was his line, his personal boundary. But he'd witnessed it. He'd said nothing. He'd continued serving, continued fighting, continued being part of the machine that ground up lives and spat out corpses. Was silence complicity? Was inaction the same as action? These were questions that kept him awake at night, that made his hands shake when he thought no one was watching, that made him wonder if he deserved to survive this war. "Contact 11 o'clock, Ernst suddenly shouted. "Enemy tank. Range 900 meters. Wilhelm's training took over, shoving philosophy aside in favor of survival instinct. His eye snapped to the periscope, searching for the threat. There, a dark shape partially concealed behind a stone wall, the distinctive silhouette of a Sherman tank, the short 75mm gun already traversing toward them. "Driver, hard right, get us behind that barn," Wilhelm ordered. "Ernst, traverse left. Track him but hold fire until we're in cover." The Tiger lurched sideways, Friedrich working the controls with practiced skill. The enemy Sherman fired, the shot going wide, passing harmlessly 10 meters to their left. They crashed through a wooden gate and positioned themselves behind a massive stone barn, using the building as a shield. "Do we engage?" Ernst asked, his finger on the firing button. Wilhelm's mind raced. This was a standard Sherman, not one of the new long-barreled monsters. At 900 meters, they had the advantage. One shot from the 88mm would punch through that Sherman's armor like tissue paper. But if he fired, the sound would attract attention. If there were more of those new tanks in the area, preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Hold fire," Wilhelm said. "We observe. If he comes around that wall and presents a clear shot at us, then we kill him. But we don't give away our position unless we have to." They waited, the Tiger's engine idling, every member of the crew tense. Wilhelm watched through his periscope as the Sherman moved cautiously forward, its commander's hatch open, a young man in an American helmet visible in the opening. The Sherman commander was looking in the wrong direction, didn't seem to know exactly where the Tiger had gone. Smart, Wilhelm thought. That Sherman commander knew he was outgunned and was being cautious, using terrain, not exposing himself unnecessarily. Good tactical sense. The kind of sense that kept you alive. After 5 minutes of careful maneuvering, the Sherman withdrew back the way it had come, apparently deciding that pursuing an unseen Tiger into close terrain was suicide. Wilhelm watched it disappear and felt a strange mixture of relief and respect. That American crew would live to fight another day, just as his crew would. "Why didn't we shoot?" Hans asked. "We had him. Easy shot. Because I'm tired of killing people who don't need to die today," Wilhelm said quietly. "And because making noise would have brought everyone in the area down on us. We have a mission: get to battalion headquarters. That's more important than one destroyed Sherman." Ernst turned in his seat, giving Wilhelm a long, measuring look. "You're changing, Wilhelm. When I first joined this crew, you would have taken that shot without hesitation. Maybe I'm learning, Wilhelm replied. Or maybe I'm just tired. Driver, continue to headquarters. Route remains the same. They moved on, leaving the encounter behind. But Wilhelm couldn't stop thinking about that American tank commander. Just a kid really, probably not much older than Hans. He had parents somewhere, maybe siblings, maybe a girl he wrote letters to. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone who mattered to people who would grieve if he died. Just like Klaus Hoffmann, burning in Tank 334. Just like Lieutenant Steiner and the 8 other men who had died this morning. Just like the thousands upon thousands of soldiers on all sides, dying in mud and snow and sand for causes they barely understood, following orders given by men who would never see a battlefield. The absurdity of it threatened to overwhelm him. They were trying to kill each other with industrial efficiency. And for what? So that some politicians and generals could push lines on a map? So that some ideology could triumph over another? What did any of it matter to the men who died screaming in burning tanks? Wilhelm realized he was gripping the edge of his periscope so hard his knuckles had gone white. He forced himself to relax, to breathe, to focus on the present moment. Depression was a luxury he couldn't afford. His crew depended on him to keep them alive, and that meant maintaining focus, maintaining discipline, maintaining the fiction that any of this made sense. Approaching battalion headquarters, Friedrich announced. I can see the command post, 200 meters ahead. Wilhelm looked through his periscope and saw a collection of camouflage tents and vehicles clustered around a half-destroyed farmhouse. Staff cars, motorcycles, a few trucks, the administrative tale of a tank battalion that had lost most of its teeth. He could see officers moving between the tents, could see radio antennas jutting up like the spines of some mechanical creature. Driver, halt at the perimeter. Will report in person. Tiger 331 ground to a stop at the edge of the command post. Wilhelm climbed out, his legs unsteady after the long ride, and dropped to the ground. A harried-looking captain approached, his uniform stained and his eyes bloodshot. You're from the engagement at Hollebeek? The captain asked without preamble. Yes, sir. Sergeant Wilhelm Hartmann, Tank 331. We're the only survivors from our platoon. The captain's expression tightened. Come with me. The major wants to hear your report immediately. As Wilhelm followed the captain toward the command tent, leaving his crew to rest by the tank, he wondered what he was going to say. How do you explain that everything they'd been told about Tiger superiority was suddenly catastrophically wrong? How do you make people understand that the enemy had found a way to beat them, and that the old tactics would just get more men killed? He didn't have good answers. He only had the memory of 3 tigers burning, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, the enemy was waiting with their new weapon, ready to kill more of them. And Wilhelm didn't know how to stop it. Major Heinrich Vogel sat behind a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates. His face gray with exhaustion and something darker. Despair poorly concealed behind military discipline. Maps covered every surface, marked with red circles indicating lost units, crossed out positions, retreat routes drawn and redrawn. Sergeant Hartmann, the major said without looking up. Tell me exactly what you saw. Wilhelm stood at attention and recounted the engagement, the invisible enemy, the devastating long-range fire, the 3 tigers destroyed in 90 seconds. As he spoke, he watched the major's expression shift from skepticism to grim acceptance. 1,700 meters, the major repeated. You're certain of the range? Yes, sir. I had time to estimate before we withdrew. The enemy tank was positioned in a hedgerow well beyond our doctrine's effective engagement distance. The major lit a cigarette with shaking hands. You're the 3rd crew to report this today. We've lost 11 tigers in the past 6 hours to what intelligence now confirms are British Sherman Fireflies. Shermans modified with 17-pound anti-tank guns. The British have been deploying them since Normandy, but we didn't understand their capabilities until now. Wilhelm felt his stomach drop. 11 tigers, 55 men, probably more considering the wounded. All because their intelligence had failed to warn them, all because their doctrine assumed German technological superiority that no longer existed. What are our orders, sir? The major looked at him with hollow eyes. Survive, Sergeant. Keep your crew alive. The war is lost, Anyone with eyes can see it. But we still have our duty. We delay, we fight tactical retreats, we make them pay for every kilometer. Not for victory anymore. Just to buy time for the civilians to evacuate, for our forces to establish defensive lines closer to home. It was the most honest thing Wilhelm had heard from a superior officer in years. The acknowledgement that they were no longer fighting to win, just fighting to lose more slowly. Understood, sir. Your tank is combat capable? Yes, sir. Full ammunition load, adequate fuel. Then get some rest. You'll move out at dawn with Kampfgruppe 3 Tigers, some infantry support, a handful of anti-tank guns. Your mission is to hold the crossroads at Messines for 48 hours while the 12th Infantry Division withdraws. After that, fall back to the secondary line. A holding action. A suicide mission dressed up in tactical language. But Wilhelm simply saluted. Yes, sir. That night, Wilhelm sat with his crew around a small fire, sharing a can of cold stew and stale bread. Ernst was cleaning his pistol with obsessive care. Hans was writing a letter home by flashlight. Friedrich stared into the flames, saying nothing. I've been thinking, Ernst said quietly, about those fireflies. If we'd known about them earlier, if intelligence had warned us properly, Klaus and the others might still be alive. We were arrogant, Wilhelm said. We believed our own propaganda. The invincible tiger, the superior German engineering. We forgot that the enemy learns too. They adapted. We didn't. Hans looked up from his letter. My father used to say that pride comes before the fall. I never understood what he meant until today. Friedrich spoke for the first time in hours. I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of watching friends burn. Tired of pretending this makes sense. He looked at Wilhelm. If we're going to die tomorrow at that crossroads, I want to die knowing we did something right. Not just following orders. Something that matters. Wilhelm understood what Friedrich meant. They'd been fighting for abstractions, for the fatherland, for duty, for honor. But those words had lost their meaning somewhere between Russia and Belgium, somewhere between the propaganda and the reality of burned villages and mass graves. We keep each other alive, Wilhelm said. That's what matters. Not flags or medals or ideology. Just getting through this together. The battle at Messines crossroads lasted 37 hours. They faced 2 Fireflies, 6 standard Shermans, and constant artillery. Wilhelm's crew fought with desperate skill, using every lesson learned from their disasters. They engaged at extreme range when possible, used terrain religiously, never stayed exposed for more than seconds at a time. They destroyed 3 Shermans and damaged a Firefly. They lost one of their supporting Tigers to the second Firefly, the same horrible penetrating power, the same long-range lethality. But this time they understood their enemy. This time they adapted. When the order came to withdraw, Tiger 331 was battered but mobile. The crew was exhausted, traumatized, but alive. They'd held the crossroads long enough for the infantry to escape. Not a victory, but not a meaningless death either. The war ended 5 months later. Wilhelm surrendered with his crew near the Rhine, the Tiger finally out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of everything except the determination to survive. In the prisoner camp, he learned that Hans had been right to question, that their cause had been wrong from the beginning, that following orders was not enough to absolve them of responsibility. After the war, Wilhelm never spoke about his time in the Tigers except once, to a historian researching tank warfare. He explained how the Firefly had shattered German tactical doctrine, how British ingenuity had overcome Nazi arrogance, how technology alone had never been enough to win. We thought we were invincible, Wilhelm said in that interview, his voice quiet with age and regret. We learned differently, the hard way, the only way that matters. Ernst became a schoolteacher, teaching history with brutal honesty about German responsibility. Hans entered a monastery, seeking forgiveness he never quite found. Friedrich returned to Hamburg, rebuilt his life with his family, and never spoke of the war again. Tiger 331 survived the war and now sits in a museum in England, its armor scarred by battles, a testament to both German engineering and German hubris. Visitors walk around it, taking pictures, reading plaques that explain how the British Firefly could kill tigers from ranges the Germans never anticipated. Wilhelm visited the museum once before he died in 1987. He stood before his old tank for a long time, one hand touching the cold steel, remembering the friends who had burned, the enemies he had killed, the boy he had been who believed in invincibility. "We were wrong about everything," he whispered to the silent machine. "But at least we learned. At least some of us survived to understand. And in that understanding, painful and late as it was, perhaps there was a kind of redemption."